Good afternoon, Professor Ghassan Hage. My name is Xun Zhang. I'm the director of the Institute of Ethnology, and we thank you for accepting our invitation to give us the talk today. I will give a brief introduction to the Li Yih-yuan Memorial Lecture to our audience. Professor Li Yih-yuan was one of the founding fathers of Taiwan anthropology and of the establishment of this institution. He passed away in the spring of 2017. The Institute of Ethnology set up this Li Yih-yuan Lectureship in the winter of the same year to commemorate the contribution of Professor Li made to this institute and to the anthropology in Taiwan. This is the third year. The first year in 2018, we had Professor Paul Sangrin. And last year, 2019, we have John Komarov. And this year, it's our honor to have Professor Ghassan Hage. And because of the COVID-19 this year, we cannot have him personally here in Taiwan. So via the virtual lecture, I will pass the microphone to Terry because she recommend Professor Ghassan and communicate all this difficult job. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I'll just say it's my great pleasure on behalf of the Starting from the Voice Research Group to welcome Professor Ghassan Hage to present the third annual Li Yih-yuan Lecture here at the Institute of Ethnology. Ghassan Hage is a professor of anthropology at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and also a member of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and has been a president of the Australian Anthropological Society. He has done ethnographic research with Lebanese immigrants in Australia, North America, and Europe, as well as in Lebanon, moving beyond the usual questions of cultural assimilation and discrimination to look at the psychology of what he calls stuckedness and mobility, and how people imagine home and its possibilities. He is perhaps best known for his work on the nexus of multiculturalism and racism in Australia. Myself, I taught in Sydney for 2 years in the early 2000s, and when I arrived there, I found that the Australian ethnoscape and the discourse around race and culture were very different from what I was used to in the United States. And Professor Hage's books, White Nation, which was published in 2000, and Paranoid Nationalism, published in 2003, really helped me understand what was going on in Australia under the administration of John Howard. He's published a lot since then, but we don't have time to get into all of the books. But his most recent book is titled, Is Racism an Environmental Threat? It's published in 2017, and it examines the connections between how racial others and ecological crises are imagined. Professor Hage is known internationally as a critical theorist and a public intellectual, and speaks as much to activists as to academics. He's spoken and written about and to uprisings in Beirut, Gaza, Paris, and elsewhere, as well as making interventions into anthropological theory and methodology in venues that include newspapers, radio, activist panels and teach-ins, as well as university auditoriums and academic journals. And I would encourage you to just Google him. You will find all kinds of really interesting lectures and writings. Much of Professor Hage's critical theoretical work is inspired by the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and his lecture today, which draws on a book manuscript that he's just completed. I think you just sent it off, right?
No.
Almost. Okay. His lecture today is titled Pierre Bourdieu and the Politics of Symbolic Violence. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ghassan Hage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this nice introduction. Thank you. Thank you also for doing all the footwork, and for everyone else at the Institute of Ethnology for your help in organizing this. And my thanks also to the audience. I am very honored, of course, to give the Li Yih-yuan lecture, and particularly so having heard about the specificity of her work and the kind of heritage, intellectual heritage he has left. And I hope this lecture is in the same intellectual lineage. I also want to let you know that I have innovated a little bit because I have become reasonably quite sick of giving international lectures while facing my my lounge room wall, and so I have asked some brave live volunteers to join me, and I just want you to see that I've got live audience with me here. And I want to thank them, and thank them also because when everything is finished and I switch off, I'm going to actually be having beer with real people and talking all kinds of things that are happening in the world. So take that, COVID. Now, yes, as they said, this lecture is part of a book, but it's not a finished book. It's actually, it's more finished than it has been for a long time. Let's put it this way. This is a very optimistic way of putting it. I've been trying, it's one of those books I've been trying to finish for the last 20 years. And I've been teaching on Bourdieu for more than 20 years. And every time I give the course, I tell my students, you're the lucky ones because I'm giving you the final draft of the manuscript on Bourdieu. And I've been doing this for more than 10 years, so you can imagine. I actually want to start with a little story with which I start the book, and because it kind of like introduces the spirit with which I am exploring Bourdieu. And this story is basically about the first time I was a postdoc at Bourdieu Center in Paris. And it was the first time I kind of like went to Bourdieu Center. I installed myself in a big room where all the postdocs are. You will notice that I have, or not notice, but I have cochlears, which have actually made me hear a lot. But in the early 90s, when I went to Paris, I actually was using hearing aids, and I was becoming very, very deaf. My hearing aids were not working very well. So I was sitting in the postdoc room, and Bourdieu comes into the room, walks straight to me, taps on my shoulder and says, let's go and have lunch. And I kind of like thought he's going to ask other people. Then I realized, wow, he's asking me for just me and him to have lunch. What an amazing thing in my life. So I went with him, and he took me to what turned out, after I knew it was his favorite bistro, next to the Collège de France. And it was all great, except it was an exceptionally noisy place. And so he started talking, and he was working on a book called La Misère du Monde. And he started talking about all the problems the teams were having with kind of like technical issues about, machines, how to interview, etc. And I'm kind of like sitting, sort of like concentrating to try and hear what he's saying in the noise. And so after a good 10, 15 minutes, he noticed that he was monologuing and that I was just sitting there, sort of like, and so he went back a little bit and he said, mais je vous ennuie peut-être, which meant, maybe I'm boring you. And I thought, immediately I thought, this was the weirdest thing happening. Here I am living my fantasy, ultimate fantasy in life. I'm sitting in Paris in a bistro with Pierre Bourdieu, my favorite intellectual, and he's asking me, am I boring you? So I start the book with this story. And then I say, this book is the answer to the question. And so, in a way, it is a very personal take on Bourdieu, in that it is about those parts of Bourdieu that have made my mind sparkle over the years. So it's no coincidence that it has to do with the fact that that aspect of Bourdieu I explore most and I use most in my empirical research is always in a fusion between the philosophical and the sociological and anthropological. And I concentrate a lot on these parts where Bourdieu is in heavy interaction with philosophy, sometimes trying to upstage it. And it's now quite common to recognize that Bourdieu has a philosophical lineage, etc. But when I started, it was actually quite sort of like, there wasn't that much, especially in the English-speaking world, people who saw in Bourdieu more than a kind of empirical researcher dealing with empirical questions. So the take on Bourdieu that I have, I'm not claiming it is the real Bourdieu any more than any other real Bourdieu, nor am I really interested in discussing whether Bourdieu is right or wrong. I don't have, you might be surprised, I don't have an investment in Bourdieu. I have an investment in my mind sparkling. and so I'm highlighting these things, and I want people to concentrate not so much, is it Bourdieu, is it not Bourdieu, is that the right Bourdieu, is it not the right Bourdieu, but concentrate on whether it makes them think about new things, about ways of, if they have a research problem, to make them think about, does it make them see things in a different way? That's what I like people to listen to as I am presenting. And so, because, as I said, this is my own take and my own luck, and I've always sort of like keyed into an aspect of Bourdieu, which I have very early on called a critical political economy of being. Can we turn the slide, please? So, critical political economy of being, and it's partly sort of like highlighting, this is Bourdieu replying here in this quote to someone who was saying that his emphasis on accumulation, on sort of like capital, meant that he shared with marginal economists a kind of like conception of human being as driven by the accumulation of capital. And so he replied by saying, no, I don't have this conception of people. If anything, I have a conception of people as aiming to perpetuate or augment their social being. Now, this conception is already pretty much at the fusion between the philosophical and the empirical, because for Bourdieu, this question is, in a way, very Spinozist. The notion of the concept of augmentation is very Spinozist concept. It is associated with concepts of joy. And it is very important to note that it's not the same as accumulation, for instance, augmentation. Because for Spinoza, as for Bourdieu, some accumulation can lead to a diminishing of being. In the same way, if you eat too much, you end up with indigestion. So too much is not always good in this notion of augmentation. But also, so there's the politics of how you accumulate, for instance. Some people accumulate too fast, and in accumulating too fast, their fastness diminishes their being. So you have to think about the rhythm of accumulation when you are talking about augmentation of being. But also, today we are faced with a very important question, which is certain forms of being, as they augment, diminish our being. So we, for a long time, thought that augmenting development and augmenting economic wealth, etc., was part of augmenting our being. But we are faced now with the fact that augmenting, accumulating development, accumulating technological know-how, etc., is diminishing our ecological being. So a political economy of being then is not the same as any political economy. It's not about just replacing money with being, and political economy itself stays the same. It changes the very notion of how you think. And so it's also people who are in this political economy of being are not just either rich or poor. They can flourish, their living flourishes and their living diminishes and withers away. So one has to think about distribution of being, not just in terms of distribution of wealth, but distribution of many things that we will be dealing with in trying to think symbolic violence. Now, what I want to do is show you how all these Bourdieu's key concepts are themselves very much, or can be interpreted at least, as being specific takes on the accumulation of being. And I think this is very an augmentation of being in order to be able to see the depth, if you like, with which Bourdieu thinks a political economy of being, involving accumulation, diminishing, distribution, maldistribution, etc. And when we say being, let me just say very quickly, we could be talking, and sometimes I certainly talk about viability. So a political economy of being is, in a way, the same as a political economy of viability, because for Bourdieu, the question of being is really the question of viability. What is the struggle for a viable life? How we define viability socially? How people have different conceptions of viability, how they struggle over their conceptions of viability, and how they augment certain forms of viability and others. And so let me then take you to, can we have the next slide now, please? So a critical then political economy of being, social subjects, people are positioned in social, they inherit being, they strategize to augment their being, and societies are seen as assemblage concerned with the production and distribution of being. Now, can we have the next slide? So what I want to do now is go through the concept, which everyone who has read Bourdieu knows them. So habitus, illusio, capital, field, symbolic power, mode of domination, social reflexivity, and just show you how this concept, in fact, can be taken to be a specific angle on the accumulation of being and the augmentation, etc., the whole political economy of it. So we'll start with habitus. Next. But what I want to show you also with what I started with is that how in Bourdieu not only is there a conception of viability and political economic being in all these concepts, but each of these concepts is actually a dialogue with a long philosophical tradition. And so habitus is viability as practical efficiency. That is, it's about, when Bourdieu talks about deploying oneself in the world, you have to think of it like a machine deploying yourself. You know, we have now, especially in our imaginary, technological imaginary, we have a machine that goes like this and sort of like moves like this. It deploys itself. It moves into the world. And so the body deploys itself technically in the world. And it classifies and moves into the world. And habitus is of the order of the efficiency of the order of classification and practice. And it is a very vitalist conception that runs systematically through Bourdieu's work. And we find that while he is arguing it, he is continuously in dialogue with Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, and a whole tradition which sees the viability of life as capacity to act, as energy, power, efficiency, force. So a viable life from this individualist perspective is a life which is capable of deploying itself efficiently, whatever efficiently means. Illusio. Next slide, please. Now we missed illusio, didn't we? Can we go back to the... So illusio is viability as the existence of a raison d'être for living. So illusio, Bourdieu talks about sort of like, that is how you invest yourself in a path which makes your life meaningful. So you have a variety of paths that you can take. You invest yourself in being a carpenter, you invest yourself in being an academic, etc. But when you invest yourself in that path, that is, you are gambling with yourself, but you are saying, I'm going to throw myself into this path, and this path is, if it works for me, it's gonna give my life a meaning. Suddenly the world has meaning for me because I've got this path. So this is then what we call existential viability, as opposed to practical viability, which is the habitus viability. Existential viability, in a sense, very similar to what Husserl called project, and not accidentally, because as many who have read about Bourdieu know that Bourdieu started at least his doctoral thesis with Canguilhem on Husserl's concept of time. But this work on what what kind of thing I throw myself in the world, is it going to yield meaningfulness for me? Is it going to make my life worthwhile? All these concepts of worthwhileness of the path I take, worthwhileness of life, are structured around the notion of illusion. Capital, next slide, please. So capital, again, is another take on viability, which is probably the most straightforward, which is viability as recognition. So here, a viable life is a recognized life. And notice, in illusio, in a sense, it is an internal recognition. You notice how illusio is not as dependent on others, on recognition. This is me gambling. I mean, it is ultimately, but you notice that with illusio, it is more, I think, like I'm talking, I think my life is going well as a carpenter. I'm doing some pretty good work here. And actually, hey, maybe carpentry is for me and I am for carpentry, etc. The relation built. I'm not dependent as much on others saying, wow, good on you, you're fantastic. I am, but not as much, right? And so, but it is something I have to be in with illusio. While with capital, it is totally dependent on the game of recognition. Now, capital is often perceived like a subcategory of illusio. In a sense, if I invest myself in being a carpenter, I start accumulating tools, and people might recognize my capacity to work with tools as capital and say, wow, excellent, good on you. So you accumulate recognition, and which, as most people who work on recognition know, this is a continuous dialogue in Bourdieu with the Hegelian and post-Hegelian tradition. Now these habitus, illusio, capital, I call them a little bit artificially anthropological concepts, in the sense that they are much more about what human beings do or can do in order to accumulate and augment their being, etc. Now, we move to next slide, please. So the sociological concepts, which are concepts not about viability insofar as the person is concerned, but viability in relation to the social world in which they exist. So the field, first of all, is not just a scene where things happen for Bourdieu, it is a causal force. The field has its own sort of like causal capacities. It's not just the individuals in it. And it highlights the fact that ultimately viability is social in its nature, not individual. It is social being and social viability. It is structured, socially determined and irreducible to individuals. The field is about the distribution of being, and it's about the space where people struggle for being, etc. And again, here we have a whole discussion that is happening with Durkheim, Mort, and Lévi-Strauss about the sui generis nature of the social. Next slide, please. Now, the field is also a space of struggle, and this brings us to the concept of symbolic power, which defines a very unique viability, which is the viability as the capacity to create one's own reality. That is symbolic power, and that's where we have to be very careful. Symbolic, you don't understand much about symbolic if you take Bourdieu to mean symbolic as opposed to material. Symbolic, actually, Bourdieu might not like me saying this, but in fact, he shares the concept of symbolic with Lévi-Strauss, with Lacan, with Althusser, with all of these people who are surrounding, which is the idea that the symbolic is the order of meaningful reality. It's not something ideational as opposed to reality. The symbolic order is the order of meaningful reality. And that's why symbolic power, Bourdieu calls it, the power to make and unmake, that's a quote, the power to make and unmake reality. Symbolic power is the power to make and unmake reality. What does it mean to talk about the power to make and make reality? The next slide will tell you all about it. If I had it my way, I would have this photo as the cover of the book. But Duke University Press thinks it will be very, very expensive to get the copyright for this. So, but I mean, in a funny way, you have a very good schematization of what does it mean to create the own reality on which you move best. So you create the snow on which you are sliding. And this, in a way, exactly is the imaginary of symbolic power. Symbolic power is there is an anthropological dimension to it, which is the idea that we humans are ecological beings. Ecological being in the sense that through our existence, we create our own ecology that around us. And so ecology in the sense of people will have all kinds of words for this. Life world, experiential reality, etc. But all of these all hint to the idea that when we exist in the world, as we deploy ourselves into the world, we make our surrounding, our take and our surrounding, the space in which we thrive, we try to make it. Now, this ideally is everyone is left alone to make their own reality. But because we are never left alone, some people have the power to make their surrounding reality more than others. And this is where we end up now talking, where we lead, what all this is leading us to in thinking symbolic violence, which is the question where symbolic power becomes symbolic domination. So symbolic power is the power to create one's ecological surrounding. Symbolic domination is when you force your own ecology on others, when you force your reality on others and make others enter your own reality. You know, I mean, the classical case of symbolic domination is basically when the Europeans went to the Americas. So a whole new reality comes and puts itself and institutes itself and insert people who used to be in another reality into a new reality. So this is, in a sense, the imaginary behind symbolic domination. But this takes us to another concept. Another slide, please. The sociological concepts, which are modes of domination. So the field is not just a space where you have people fighting over capital, etc. It is a space where people are trying to institute their reality and let others become part of their reality as opposed to vice versa. That is, they want to thrive by making others subservient to their reality. So we have to think that in Bourdieu, usefully, we have domination as a practice. So you dominate, there's analysis. You have domination as a social relation. And very interestingly, domination is a state of the field. That is, what the field is structured by domination, and say, so what kind of domination structures the field? You say, domination is a state of the field. Now there's forms of domination, what I call aristocratic, or Bourdieu calls actually aristocratic and democratic forms of domination. And there is degrees of domination. So you can try and be early in the process of domination as an orthodoxy, which means you have instituted yourself into an orthodox power, and then symbolic violence. We will come to this as they are the core of where we are moving to, but I want to first finish with the last important Bourdieu concept in thinking viability. Next slide. Which is the epistemological concept of social reflexivity. Now, often people take social reflexivity to be something that sociologists do, which is very much what Bourdieu does. But in fact, in a series of lectures, which I actually don't know whether much of it has been published. But when second time I was with Bourdieu, he was giving a series of lectures on the social conditions of lucidity, what he called lucidity. And I'm not sure, frankly, to what extent this has been published yet, if any of these lectures have been published, because they're publishing the lectures at the moment. And so here, the question of lucidity is very much linked to the question of social reflexivity. That is how, from your position, you are lucid about where you are, what you are doing, the kind of reality your location is sort of like, I think there is, I know in terms of publication, there is one article where Bourdieu talks about interviewing, and he's interviewing the person, and he makes the whole point of analyzing not just the content of the interview, but asking the question, why is it that this particular interviewee has this particular form of lucidity? And so what is it about the social conditions of production of the interview and the location of the person interviewed which produced lucidity? So lucidity involves reflexivity, which involves thinking through about your location, your inheritances, the perspective, the various social determinations that bring the reality you are enmeshed in. Now, this is social reflexivity and lucidity in general, but of course, for Bourdieu, the crucial thing has been the reflexivity of the social analysts themselves. Now, this is a very tricky thing for Bourdieu, and it's very hard to always keep it in mind. But as you are thinking about habitus, illusio, capital, domination, Bourdieu wants you to always remember that you are, like me, like the people here, like you listening, you are intellectuals and academic thinking about this. So you are engaged in the practice. So I am giving this lecture now. I can analyze it. I want to be efficient in delivering to you. So I am engaging in a game of viability. I want to be efficient in conveying things to you as much as possible. I have an investment in what I'm trying to achieve. It makes my life worth living, definitely. I am invested in academic pursuit, and I have the academic illusio, etc. So, and Sure, I began saying to you that I don't mind if you think this is not the real Bourdieu, etc. But this is a strategy in the field of Bourdieuism, right? Of course, I want to be someone who dominates the field of Bourdieuisness, and I want recognition and of what I deploy. So all of these things, and so I'm engaging in games of domination in the field of Bourdieuism while I am, but also other fields, right? So it's not, people are not located in just one field. But so what is important then is to always have a sense that part of being able to be lucid about what you are doing, and this is very crucial, is a particular form of viability in Bourdieu. It is the viability that gives you what he calls the margin of freedom. And what he calls margin of freedom, and it's the whole debate he has for a long time with Sartre about are we free individuals, etc. Bourdieu starts with a very determinist conception of that. But he says, in the midst of our determination, reflexivity and the capacity to be lucid about our determination opens up a margin of freedom. This is it. Now, it is kind of like clearly debatable, but it is an interesting debate. Does knowing about our determination gives us freedom from a margin of freedom? There's no freedom. There's no freedom for Bourdieu. And so then to kind of like summarize all this, next slide, please. So when you say, what is a viable practice? A viable practice has to be efficient. It has to give meaning to our lives. It has to yield recognition. It has to be lucid about the conditions and effects of its unfolding. It has to produce and reproduce the ecological conditions of its thriving and flourishing. Likewise, non-viable dominated practices are the opposite. They are inefficient, they are meaningless in the sense that you don't get the sense that life is worth living out of doing them. They yield little recognition, are blind to their own conditions of existence, reproduce the ecological world of the dominant class in which they become enmeshed rather than their own world. They are sick, and I'm using sick in a playful way because sick in French is malade. And we have it in English as maladie, but in fact, the concept malade is one of the earliest concepts where habitus is used, because malade is actually a hyphenation of mal habitus in its etymological history. It is someone who is not doing very well at deploying themselves into the world, so to speak. So with this in mind, let us now examine domination, because notice that this is viable practice, not viable practice is not, definitely not some kind of binary opposition. Practices are not either viable or not viable. It is a continuum of more or less. Practices are more or less efficient, more or less meaningful, more or less. And some move more towards not viable and some move towards the viable, but it's not that they are so neatly positioned. And of course, they can always ameliorate themselves. And there are practices which are very inefficient that suddenly become efficient, and practices are efficient that suddenly become inefficient, etc. Because all of it is contextual to a field. Okay, next. So, symbolic domination. Let's remember, we're talking symbolic power is the symbolic power. It's the power of making and unmaking reality. That is making and making the ecological space in which you exist, your surrounding. You want your surrounding, because if you look at a concept like efficiency, for instance, it's a body cannot be efficient or inefficient. A body is efficient or inefficient in a particular environment. So the very notion of efficiency cannot, so struggling for efficiency is struggling for both making the body capable and making the environment in which the body is capable the best possible thing for the body. This is why all struggles are reality struggles in this sense. They are struggles for these ecological existence. So not every symbolic power is a form of domination. Symbolic power is simply the power to exist, etc. But you start talking about domination when you have one group's reality forcing itself on other groups' realities, making others part of it. You can make it by sort of like symbolic domination can be through forcing what Bourdieu calls, well, transforming your illusio into collusio, he tells. So that is, a group dominates by making their own aspiration the dominant aspiration. Everybody should aspire to this. Everybody should aspire for cultural, national values. If sort of like national values is a very classical example of attempting to engage in symbolic domination through transforming illusio into collusio. Illusio is a path in life that may. Collusio is when a whole group colludes to agree that this is the path, this is the way to go. Now, symbolic domination in Bourdieu texts is either democratic or aristocratic. I found these two differentiations very useful from the start. In fact, if you go in White Nation, you will, my book White Nation, you will find that I already deploy the difference between the aristocratic and the democratic. What is aristocratic domination? Aristocratic domination is basically when the dominant, I'm sorry, I've lost it here. So aristocratic domination is when the dominant class institute a differentiation between the realities of the dominant and the realities of the dominated. They don't say, in fact, we don't share a reality. In fact, the classical way, the best way to think aristocratic domination is apartheid. I say, we've got our world, you've got your world, we've got our roads, you've got your roads, we've got our aspirations, you've got your aspirations, but we still are dominating you. It's not that you're apart, but together. Somehow it's useful to be together when you're apart like this. And so the classical mode of aristocratic So aristocratic domination is dependent on the other knowing their place and saying, you stay in your place. This is where you belong. And so for Bourdieu, the classical aristocratic domination is masculine domination because it institutes a division between what males do, what females do, what females can aspire for, what males can aspire for, what is internalized by the female body, what's internalized by the male body, etc. And so instituting the differences and making people, to domination, making people accept the institution. So now now notice that it's not a matter of belief. It is not a matter of belief here, sort of like just in terms of, I think it is a question of the body not being able to aspire to do certain things, you know, in the way, you know, me, I'm pretty short. In case you can't see this out there in Taipei, let me tell you, I'm pretty short. And so, as a short body, I realistically never aspired to become a member of the Lakers or the Chicago Bulls. You know, it's not part of my imagination. I can see that this is not where my body can go. In terms of, so the question of aspiration is not simply that you mentally don't. It is that your body is constituted by social in such a way that it cannot aspire for certain things, but it can aspire for other things. So aristocratic domination depends on the internalization of those divisions. And it is aristocratic in the sense that it essentializes. This is, you can only get it by inheritance. You inherit this and you inherit it. You inherit maleness, you inherit femaleness. Some forms of racism are very aristocratic, or try to be at least. Okay, now democratic mode of domination, it is democratic but perverse actually, because as we see in the final analysis, it is also structured by an implicit aristocratic logic. Here, instead of dominating by saying, this is what we dominant do, and this is what you dominated do, the dominant say, everyone should be something. We should all be X. So we should all be Australian. And today, very importantly, we should all be secular Republican French people. This is open, it's democratic. It's not only French people of a certain type can be this and the others should be. No, the idea is that everybody should, it's open, it's democratic. However, interestingly, and that's why it is perversely democratic, because its history is a history of stopping people from accessing what it says it's openly open to be accessed. So it engages in a practice that negates what it is continuously claiming to do. That fine. So let me put here, French republicanism as a tool of white rule works by fostering this form of democratic domination over its immigrants of color. It is continuously hammering the idea that access to full French citizenship is available to all. while the history of racism and colonialism continuously works to stop those people of color from accessing what everybody's saying, it's open for you. Come on, what's wrong with you? Just do it. So the idea, while white France has a long history of advocating democracy as universal, but when people of color aspire for it, they work to crush them. And that's true internationally too. In Haiti, Toussaint Louverture proclaimed freedom and democracy. Napoleon went and crushed them. Since then, they do it all the time. They say, advocate democratic domination. And so there's something sadistic in this kind of domination, because it says to everyone should aspire. But at the same time, it says, no, not everyone should aspire. And so it plays, and this is a very common game in all national themes, where there's an advocacy of national culture, national values, etc. No nation says, really, national value is just for us. But all nations say, really, national value is just for us, not for you. They do that at the same time. National value is, of course, it's for everyone who is in the nation, and national value is only for us, some aristocratic elite. So the game between aristocracy and democracy here sort of like creates the kind of like sadism. Now, domination is not just types, but degrees. It's a matter of degree, how dominant. So, and this is where it takes us to the difference between what Bourdieu calls orthodoxy and what he calls symbolic violence. Now, what happens in the game of domination? Domination emerges initially as a struggle where the gaze of each competitor on the other is horizontal. In a field, I'm competing with you. I'm competing with you. The gaze is horizontal. I'm going to make my reality more dominant than yours. I'm going to survive more than you. The gaze is horizontal. But then Bourdieu argues every domination attempts institutionalization. That is, a state, bringing the state in to institutionalize one's dominance. And so what we have is something very interesting, where the process of domination from being horizontal starts aspiring to be vertical, top down. And so from the imaginary of war, I'm fighting you, we move to, and war has a horizontal gaze, to an imaginary of policing. So here, I'm not fighting you as an equal, rather, you're a problem. That is, the dominant moves from saying, I'm fighting in my aim to win against you. The dominant starts saying, I'm fighting to maintain the order of things. That is, symbolic violence is when your order becomes the order of things. And so when you are maintaining it, you're no longer fighting a war to maintain it, you are policing to maintain it. The shift between warring and policing is very crucial in the fluctuation between states of orthodoxy and domination and states of symbolic violence. If you take today the politics, the international politics of Donald Trump, and its difference with the international politics of the Democratic Party. you find a very classical tension between a desire to engage in symbolic violence and a desire to fight in the name of your group. So for a long time, US foreign policy was about maintaining the international order. And of course, critics will say that the international order is really the US trying to dominate everyone. But the US will maintain itself that there's an international order, and I'm policing, in fact, the international order. With Trump, we have the US first. I am not fighting for any, in fact, I'm leaving the United Nations, leaving all this. The imaginary of Trump is an imaginary of domination in horizontal mode. In fact, it is, in a way, less top-down look at others. Say, it's you or me. I'm going to win, not you. While the Democratic Party still have a fantasy of symbolic violence, where it is aspiring not to say, America, we're going to win over. No, it still aspires to say, let's have a national order and we will police the national order, or via, etc. So fluctuations, you find that again in Israel, Palestine. If you look at the way Israelis deal with Palestinians, their language continuously shifts. Are they at war with Palestinians or are they policing the Palestinians? Are the Palestinians outlaws or are they enemies? Sort of like the imaginary of war is the imaginary, the other is in the imaginary of war, the other exists in another domain. The imaginary of policing, the other is a problem in my domain. And so the imaginary of symbolic violence is to transform all domains as my domain. And my aim is to police it as my domain. Now, I'm conscious of the time, and I want to conclude with some reflections which might appear a bit as paradoxical, which has to do with how useful is the concept of symbolic violence today, and what kind of analytical work is it able to do. Now, symbolic violence always involves a kind of naturalization of domination. That is, something that dominates no longer carries the trace of its domination. You know, if I, here in Australia, I'm asking someone in my live audience, what date is it? What date is it? Just tell me.
7th. Yeah, 7th.
7th
of December.
It's 7th of December, I was told. Now, notice, 7th of December seems like a natural date. And the person who answered me didn't say to me, actually, there was a long history of struggle between the Gregorian calendar and the non-Gregorian calendar, and in fact, etc. And the fact that it is December the 7th today is the fact that we have naturalized the dominance of the Gregorian calendar. That is, the date has lost the history of it as a history of dominance. This is the idea of symbolic violence. Symbolic violence is that you lived in a reality and think that's how it is. That's how it is. And it's important for Bourdieu, it's symbolic violence is that the violence is and reaches the categories with which you can think your situation. So, like when Bourdieu is analyzing the state, he says, can I analyze the state when my language and my concepts have been inculcated in me by the state? This is a very French thing. So how can I analyze a reality when the very tools for thinking this reality are already dominated by the thing I'm trying to analyze? And so symbolic violence involves that depth then. This allows us to think through domination. So, in a way, one can say symbolic violence is a fantasy of power. Is a fantasy of power in the sense that, sure, there's forms of symbolic violence everywhere, but there are very few places really today where power and domination are so extremely naturalized that we don't think of them as domination. Most forms of domination are recognized as domination. In fact, we can say that we live in the era of decline of symbolic violence. A lot of things that used to be taken for granted and natural are being unmade. Masculine domination, the belief in development, progress, all of these used to exert a form of symbolic violence. That is, they were taken for granted that what are you doing? Well, we seek more development. Now, we question it. Notice, it's not arguing that masculine domination does not exist anymore. And it's not arguing that developmental modes of thinking the world don't exist anymore or are not dominant. They are still dominant, but they are recognized as dominant. And that is what Bourdieu calls orthodoxy. States of orthodoxy are states where the dominant are still dominant, but they are not capable of hiding their dominance. You can recognize this is a state of domination. I recognize who is dominating here. I know that the US is dominating the world system. I know that males dominate. I know that capitalist mining, etc., dominate. They no longer, however, hide their domination to the extent they used to before. Even the nation state used to be such a normal mode, it's been undone. When I was a kid, the idea that Scotland might secede in England was such a normal category for me that the idea that it might break up was just unimaginable. Sort of like France, etc. Sort of like now we see rise of nationalism, but at the same time, there is no naturalization of national entities. So again, we live in an era where there is less and less, in a sense, symbolic violence. Paradoxically, the less relevant is the concept of symbolic power and symbolic violence in accounting for current configurations of domination. The more important is the concept of a political economy of being that forms its backbone. Precisely because we live in an era where the being of most classes is withering and dying and diminishing rather than flourishing. And that is where I want to kind of like finish, because symbolic violence violent as it is actually something that we used to share. We used to share the nation state. We used to share things sort of like that dominate us, but we don't think. Let me give you an example. It's at the core of Bourdieu's concept of habitus. And it's a research question. When you're working with immigrants, newly arrived immigrants, one of the themes that always emerges out of nowhere is the question of tiredness. When you're working with immigrants on the whole will tend to tell you, I'm tired, I'm tired, I'm tired, I'm tired, I'm tired, I'm tired. And some of us about 20 years ago started thinking about this actually, thinking, so what's this thing? Tired, 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 tired. And then we started reflecting on the fact that, well, think about this. If you wake up in the morning and you want to take the bus and start by saying, okay, where should I go, right or left? Wait a second, I think I should go right. And then maybe the bus, okay, here's the bus. How do I stop the bus? Remind me again. Okay, maybe this way. Oh, God, this bus has moved. It didn't stop. I did the wrong thing. I'm going to do it again. I'm on the bus. How am I going to pay for the bus? So where am I going to stop? I'm giving you an example of riding the bus. It's exhausting if you haven't done it in a routine manner. And so tiredness comes when you have not routinized reality, where everything, the money, we used to kind of like say in your circle that rational choice theorists, in fact, imaginary of society is a society of exceptionally tired people, because they seem to think that every single bit of something that people have to do will involve sort of like deliberation, etc. You're exhausted by in 5 minutes of living if you follow rational choice theory people about this. So we are dependent on a society in which we are naturalizing our existence. Denaturalizing, and that's what Bourdieu advocates in the face of symbolic violence, denaturalizing and defatalizing is tiring. I mean, it's exhausting. Just think about, I don't know if you share my view of this, but I just think about when we started having to say he or she, as opposed to just he. When we started having to say man or woman instead of man. And needless to say, I'm not arguing against it for a split second. I think it's a great thing, great to our consciousness. But it is demanding. It actually requires time, requires thinking. It has ruined many poetic sentences, etc., etc., etc. So the fact of the matter is that denaturalizing something that used to be natural, that man is a category of, etc., takes it out of you. It's exhausting. And so it is not, and so people talk about decolonizing a lot. And yeah, sure, I'm for calling Sydney its indigenous name and Melbourne its indigenous name. And that can happen, and it is a decolonization. And of course, it is in order of breaking up the symbolic violence which naturalizes the dominance of Sydney. And we take it for granted that Sydney like the date. And so the people who are engaging in decolonization are fighting the symbolic violence of Anglo names by calling Sydney its indigenous name, etc. But there's a shared sociality which is destroyed in the process. You cannot deny that. I mean, it's easy to say, give an indigenous name to Sydney. But let me say, what if you want to undo the English introduction of left-hand driving? How do you decolonize that? I say, I'm going to opt for right-hand driving. I don't care what you do. I mean, I'm being a bit silly, but at the same time, I'm trying to highlight for you that some choices of decolonization and choice of fighting symbolic violence involves removing shared sociality. And so we have to think very hard when we engage in the politics of fighting symbolic violence that it's not enough to just challenge domination, undo domination. We have to be able to institute another sociality. Because if we only challenge without instituting a sociality, we are destined to engage, to be very tired for a very, very long time. And that's not very good for our being, I don't think. Okay, thank you. I can take questions now.
Okay, so let's open up the floor for questions.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, since from your presentation and also from what I read from Bourdieu, he did a thesis on Husserl's concept of time. And the description you gave as field and also social domination is similar to Husserl's notion of Lebenswelt. So I was wondering if you have any consideration about that, and also wondering about the critique that Bourdieu himself did in the concept of habitus, criticizing phenomenology as an epistemological fallacy. If you can, if you have some reflection about that, thank you.
Yes. Yes. The thing is, sort of like, I'm very happy, and I will reply to your question in relation to Bourdieu phenomenology and Husserl's concept of time, and his critique of phenomenology in the logic of practice, in outline of theory of practice. Except that I have to also say that this is something I try to avoid doing, because it's a bit too theoreticist for my mind. You know, I'm kind of like, in the sense of, I prefer to say, if you say to me, I've got a research problem which I cannot make sense of if I don't take into account Bourdieu's critique of phenomenology, rather than us simply being discussing Bourdieu for the sake of Bourdieu or phenomenology for the sake of phenomenology. Having said that, let me say to you that Bourdieu has the most systematic history of criticizing all the people that he uses. And in fact, the more you can read him criticizing, the more you know that soon he is going to take on board something he is criticizing. So he did it with Sartre, he did it with psychoanalysis, he did it with feminism. I mean, the way he kind of like poo-pooed Simone de Beauvoir incredibly, and then masculine domination, he basically took so much of what she said, while still poo-pooing her. But at least you can't say that he only did it to women. He did it to all the men as well. And the same goes to phenomenology. Now, the issue with Bourdieu is that, and I think he is nominally right, he wants a phenomenology that is more sociological. That is, a phenomenology which does not take only as its starting point some human hanging out there or some being that is just hanging out there. He wants you to say, okay, this being is located already in relations of power and already in specific locations, and you cannot do a phenomenology which is not at the same time structuralism. And so, yes, I think it's very good, and I like that this is why, in a way, that idea of a political economy of being that I want to emphasize is a political economy. But also why I like to think of it as a critical political economy, that Bourdieu is not just engaging in a political economy of being, that is, he's not just interested, okay, this is how being and viability circulates in society, this is how certain forms of viability are dominated by others. He wants to say there's fundamental inequalities, there's fundamental modes of the domination. And so that is part, in a way, a critique of phenomenology in itself. When it is, I playfully say that in introducing this question of economy of being, that Bourdieu is a bit anti-Shakespearean, but also anti-Heideggerian, because by speaking of a political economy of being, he in fact is saying that to be or not to be is not the question. He is saying that being is a more or less issue, not an either or. It's not either you be in life or you not. In fact, the issue is how much to be, not to be or not to be. And that, in a sense, embodies very much a critique of the whole Husserlian project in a schematic way.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm sort of having a little trouble understanding how you're conceptualizing the boundaries, let's say, if you want to use the word, between symbolic power and symbolic domination. Because you mentioned at one point that not all symbolic power is necessarily symbolic domination. So which leads me to want to know more how you conceptualize symbolic power which does not involve domination. As you define it at one point as when a dominant group forces its worldview or its symbolic system on another. But then sort of going back to your point at the very beginning, how it's not simply, the material and the symbolic as sort of separate realms, but rather, the symbolic is itself material. It kind of poses the question of, well, when and where is that dominant group imposing itself on these others located? You mentioned sort of one historical moment, which is the colonization of the New World. But other than that kind of sort of primal moment, is this an ongoing? I mean, I'm sort of having trouble understanding whether sort of this dominance sort of comes before, conceptually, historically, before its subsequent, symbolic institutionalization. So it's more the question of, is there a symbolic power which is not dominant? What does it look like? Are there examples? And then related to that, you also mentioned, and this is a related question, you oppose viable practice to non-viable dominated practices. And so it's the question is, does the word viable practice then include, in parentheses, non-dominated practice? I'm just wondering if you could elaborate that more? What is non-domination?
You've packed a lot here. Just let me start with the issue that you raised about what does a symbolic power that is not domination look like. I think the question has to do with how you understand the concept of power, because it's a classical division between power over and power to do. And so when I say that there is such a thing as symbolic power that is not domination, I'm using power in the sense of capacity. So that is, I am saying humans have symbolic power. That is, they have the power, they have the capacity to create the environment in which they thrive. So that is the idea of symbolic power here, as capacity. And so here, technically, the notion of I have the power, I am empowered, and I'm able, that is part of me. That's why I said, in a sense, it's an anthropological given that we humans have the power to create. In fact, I don't think we humans only. I think all beings have the power to create the ecological space around them in which they thrive. Now, so the issue is that, however, we don't exist alone in the world, and nobody lets us do what we want to do. Even something. Let me give you an example. If I want to identify as I invariably identify as Lebanese or Australian, or both, or fusion, etc. And let me say that in a particular morning, I felt Lebanese. And I felt I needed to thrive in a Lebanese environment, so I go and buy myself a Lebanese breakfast. That is, to me, my Lebanese self is thriving through eating a Lebanese breakfast. It's not to be laughed at. It's a very important thing. And so now the issue is that there will be some maniac who will not let me do this, right? Who will say, this is Australia, how dare you sort of like impose your Lebanese self in Australia. So we are not left alone to thrive. People challenge us, people force us to do things. You have to defend yourself and your being. So when these challenges become institutionalized, when some people start controlling certain institutions and enforcing their modes of existence and being on others, this is where we have domination. So this is how I'm differentiating between the two. I hope that makes it a bit clearer, but.
Thank you.
Please do.
So I've probably read more of your Facebook posts than your books, so I don't know a lot of your writing about white nationalism or some of these issues, but it seems to me that you're getting somewhere with this. You were talked about the limits of decolonization, but you also seem to be talking about the limits of nationalism, of white nationalism, the limits of this kind of Australian. You're talking about trying to impose his culture on a Lebanese immigrant trying to eat breakfast. And I'm thinking about that a little bit in terms of, say, comparison with, say, what's going on in France, and trying to think through how French Bourdieu's theory is. I mean, you have this French laïcité, this idea that we are universal, but that universal in France includes symbols of Christian religion, but you can't have any symbols of Muslim religion. And I'm just trying to understand, is some of how this would maybe work in a comparative process context, and what some of these limitations might be. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for this. I mean, as you would have noticed, I already hinted about the usage of the notions of symbolic violence to think through what's happening in France today. And I think, I've always had this kind of like bity, which helps me define how symbolic violence works in relation to integration and demands for integration, even when it is in the form of laïcité. And basically, the formula goes like this. Whenever you hear someone shouting, you need to integrate, it means they want to see you disintegrate. It's very simple. You hear someone shouting from the rooftop, you must integrate, that person wants you to disintegrate. Because sociologically, it's not an argument against integration, mind you. It's an argument against people shouting it off the rooftops. There's no historical evidence ever that lots of white people shouting at non-white people has made anybody change their mind in history, and definitely not in France. I think if you look quietly at the history of integration of people in France, you will find an amazing sort of like history of lots of people from all over the place integrating into French society and becoming part of French society. But you will also find that none of them integrated because somebody shouted at them. There's good sociological reasons why people integrate more than others, and more quicker than others, and why some people don't integrate as well. And as you said, we have come to a point, with laïcité. I think what we have in France today are people who are sick and tired of trying to be French. There's a limit to how long people can endure trying to be French. Like they try to be French for 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 years. After a while, people would like someone to look at you and say, excellent effort, instead of, no, you failed. You failed again because blah, blah, blah. So after a long history of trying, failing, some people say, well, go to hell. I'm going to become Muslim, whatever. And then you say, see, they don't integrate. So I think looking at this through the lens of symbolic violence and the fantasies of symbolic violence gives us a very good take and illuminating take.
Thank you for your talk. Following your interpretation of Bourdieu, can I ask question one? Where there is no choice, there is symbolic domination. And my second question is, it looks like every culture is one kind of symbolic violence. And every culture is a symbolic violence to nature. Is it true?
Thanks. Thank you for your question. I don't think there is symbolic violence to nature. I think there is violence to nature. I mean, the idea of precisely the idea of symbolic violence is a violence which hides itself as violence. And I think our relation to the natural world has been one of the least needy of hiding itself, because we thought, in fact, that is why we often use metaphors of domination of animals by humans to illuminate what humans do to humans. So we say, this person is driving his workers like a man is driving a bull. And we think that's because we morally think people mistreating a bull was fine for so long. And people who were mistreating the bull didn't need to hide the fact that they were mistreating the bull. And so it is much more apparent, while people being treating their workers badly is something they want to hide. And so we use animal metaphors to reveal the processes of interhuman domination. I think there has been a lot of violence to nature, which has been, if you like, coming to the fore as to what is the effect of this violence. And to what extent the notion of symbolic violence can help us think through human relation to nature. I think, to me, the most important question which I pointed to, which I like to develop more probably, has to do with the symbolic, with the end of the symbolic violence of productivism. Productivism and the idea of progress and the idea of exploitation of nature and domestication of nature for a long time was taken for granted as the norm, as what you do, as that's what happens. But this is what is unraveling today. And through its unraveling, it allows us to think new relations to nature. That's where I ended, that it's not enough to undo symbolic violence. We want to the extent that we don't want to end up in a world where there's no sociality. Because interestingly, some of the right is precisely where they want to go. A world with no sociality. To allow for unlimited exploitation and unlimited forms of domination. They want a world with no sociality. So the old Foucaultian Il faut défendre la société takes on an even more important dimension. We must think and defend the social space and not destroy it without thinking of another way of being social, which includes with nature.
Thank you so much for your talk today. I have a question, probably a simple but kind of broad question. So why is it useful that we revisit symbolic violence now? I think you've theorized a lot and kind of move forward from Bourdieu's framework and talk about how symbolic violence is a practice, right? And how a lot of the kind of violences have actually been instituted in our society. It's actually quite materialized. It's very visceral. It's very physical, right? A lot of examples you gave on the naturalization of violence, or thinking about like the right wing's attacks on civil society and whatnot. It's actually quite material. So why do we hold on to the concept of symbolic? Why is it still a useful framework, I think? Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's precisely what I began by saying, that symbolic is not the opposite of material. It is, symbolic refers to meaningful reality in the way that it is a reality that, in opposition to what Lacan would call the real, what others sort of like as undifferentiated reality. And so our modes of classification and our interests interact with undifferentiated reality to make a differentiated reality. That is generally the schema which has been behind Althusser's concept of ideology, Lacan's notion of the real, and Lévi-Strauss's notion of the symbolic. And Bourdieu takes it on, but instead of making it a structure of the symbolic, he makes it a practice of the symbolic. And it's, I think it's very material. I don't think at all that it is very material in that it works on the order of meaning, and it is trying to differentiate itself from pure brute physical violence. So by saying that the state monopolizes modes of categorization, for instance, Bourdieu is talking to Max Weber on the monopoly of physical violence. And so there is a difference, if you like, between physical violence and symbolic violence, in the sense of a difference between shooting someone and arguing with someone. But it's not an argument that arguing with someone is less material than shooting someone, or vice versa. I think at least this is the concept of materiality that people who use this form of the symbolic are working with. I think it is really crucial, however, to think through the importance of the change that I referred to, when power used to aspire to be symbolic violence. Symbolic domination used to aspire to be symbolic violence. That is, it aimed, so all the theorists of like Gramsci on hegemony, sort of like Althusser with ideological state apparatuses, all of them have this fantasy that the ultimate aim of domination is a domination that people do not experience as domination. What is interesting today is that we have a power which no longer, we have a form of domination which no longer aspires to be symbolic violence. It is actually quite happy with itself being what I call naked power. Naked power. Now, naked power is something which everybody uses in a kind of like way, but I think it's an interesting theoretical concept today, naked power. You know, I mean, Saudi Arabia invited a journalist to its embassy, killed him, cut him in pieces, and somebody comes and says, we intellectuals must speak truth to power. And you look at it and say, excuse me, which truth you think Saudi Arabia is hiding? Why do you think they are naked power? So when you have forms of power that no longer aspire to hide themselves, how do you think of a politics? Is not an issue of material, not material. I think it's all very material, but it requires a new way of imagining.
Okay, we actually have one of the people who's online wrote out a question. Did you see? Maybe they told me like it doesn't really work for the other people who are online to speak. Like there's something, it's some weird thing with the program. But if you can, do you want to read his question and answer?
I see. Okay.
Ghassan?
Sorry, I'm not managing to read any of this.
Okay, you can't read it. Okay, let's see.
Okay.
Okay.
I've got
Okay.
here. I've got a couple of here. Okay, I've got a question. I've got a comment from Megan, but I've got a question from Ian. Ian Johnson. I will read it out. My question is about a topic that Professor Hage has talked about before, the diaspora condition. He has used it to refer to people in transnational diaspora, such as Lebanese in Australia or elsewhere. My question is, if this concept can be applied to people who are in a kind of internal diaspora, living in the same state or even the same city as before, but because of various kinds of violence are pushed out of their milieu and life in a kind of virtual world surrounded by symbols of their past life. Can we use the diasporic condition to analyze these kind of people? And does Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence apply to these situations? Thank you for your question. Yes, and Megan's comment was for someone else. I think in diaspora, it doesn't really matter that much whether the mobility is international or national. It has to do with the nature of the change. Historically, a lot of immigrants, for instance, would attribute their experience to international movement without it necessarily be the case. So, like about 25 years ago, I worked with some Lebanese women and Greek women who we were working on the way they differentiated between Lebanon, Australia, Greece, and Australia. And we kind of like circled the fact that, in fact, what they were talking about was urban, non-urban. And that, in fact, these Lebanese and Greek women had moved from non-urban life, where they were, to urban location in Australia. And in the process, did not have a concept of urban life in the countries where they had gone to. So for them, urbanity was Australia, non-urbanity was Lebanon or Greece. And so we introduced Beirut and Athens to the equation and said, well, a lot of the things you're saying this is Australia are in fact Athens, as opposed to a lot of the things you say Australia is Beirut. So the difference is not national. So what I'm saying, the movement, the internal diaspora has to do with the quality of the change. And sometimes you don't need to move at all. Somebody robs you from your ground and you become diasporic simply because of your relation to a different reality which has been constituted. But I think in relation to symbolic violence, definitely the issue of tiredness that I raised come to mind. Whenever you have that change from one environment to another, a change from a place where your habitus was efficient, etc., you have a diminishing of your being because you're no longer capable of deploying yourself as efficiently. And yes, sure, I can analyze it with diasporic condition and with symbolic violence, but with many other things as well. But I think the issue is, does the concept offer you a gaze onto your research topic which allow you to see new things, right? I mean, otherwise, I mean, I could never understand these people who would go and do a beautiful piece of research and then finish the research with a, and as Bourdieu says, or as Foucault says, or as, and then we say, wait a second, you've just done this whole research without Foucault or Bourdieu or Judith Butler. Why are you making it as if they all knew what you have researched without them even going there? In the last paragraph, you just said, so you went and spent a year in wherever to tell us what Foucault already knew, sitting there in Paris and on his bum and without doing anything. He already knew it. I mean, what's the point? You know? And so unless you want to introduce a theorist to actually say, okay, this is me before I read this, and now I read this, come, I'm going to show you what I can see because I read this. And so it's productive for me. Otherwise, it's very defeating. Okay.
Okay. Well, if no one else will, I will ask one last question to sort of end on a positive note, as I always do. But I was wondering when you were kind of ended talking about how it's not enough to kind of just challenge symbolic domination, that because denaturalization is so exhausting, right? You need to to replace the sociality that you're going to lose in that challenge. So I was just wondering if you have seen any examples or know of any possibilities, that you've run across of activist strategies that do that well, that do that kind of replacement sociality and kind of simultaneously, simultaneously kind of denaturalizing the symbolic domination of the dominant group, but also kind of not being, helping people through the exhaustion. Because I think, we're all experiencing that with online stuff. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think. Thank you for this question. I think it's probably the most important question. We need to think through that question of alternative sociality, and we do have a long history of. This is, by the way, part of the subject of a book I wrote, which is called Anthropology. And the idea is that we are too dominated by an imaginary of anti-politics and how to oppose things without thinking through the alternatives to what we are anti. But I think that's definitely not the case in the environmental movement today. Definitely the environmental movement is very rich with questioning the symbolic violence of productivism and the symbolic violence of domination of nature, while at the same time providing alternative grounds for sociality. And this goes from grand theory to dealing with miners and telling them, if you lose your job, there's an alternative economy. And I think that's definitely the space where both challenging the symbolic violence of productivism and producing alternatives around notions of sustainability, etc., have been and are probably one of the most important in the world.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess we should wrap it up now. And thank you so much for that really interesting talk that will have lots to think about and talk about in the coming hours and days. So let's all round of applause for Professor Hage, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And hopefully in the not too distant future, you will be able to actually come in person and we can feed you.
I will hold you this way. I will be coming and I want good Taiwanese food.
No problem there once you come. Okay, thank you. Thank you.